So 1.6 is winding down, and that means it's about time to go ahead and take a look at what the event has given us in terms of overall world mechanics and world building, right? Now, despite the fact that Notes on Shuri focuses on a completely different group and the plotline is completely divorced from our primary plotline, we still are given some interesting points regarding certain phenomena that may affect our understanding of this world. And the primary point that I wanted to take a look at was a ritual that is referred to as Ask and Acquire by Besmerit and Company. This is a ritual that ostensibly originated in the Far East, and it is the driving force of the event, right? It is what leads Besmerit's party out to the Central Plains in order to kind of research this whole deal. But what exactly is Ask and Acquire, right? It is left a little bit vague. We have some baseline idea, a baseline purpose for what it is, but we don't have any precise notes on general mechanisms or the workings of the ritual. Even the name of the ritual kind of varies, as the residents of Pei City have a similar tradition. However, they refer to theirs as the divination. And although the names differ, we do get the sense that these are basically the same thing, just, with a different label attached to it. Now, in the Pei City, the divination's variation of the ritual, the requisite conditions were that one must jump across the broken bridge leading to the mountain temple, and in doing so, their wish would be heard by the gods and thus granted. However, this feat was deemed impossible, and the ceremony was kind of degraded into a sort of a yearly tradition sort of thing with no real practical benefit. So at its most basic form, Ask and Acquire is basically what it says on the tin, right? Even if the specifics are left a little bit murky. It is essentially a wish granting ceremony with some strings attached. Now, as a member of Besmerit's research party, Urian, had put it, it is like a vow that one makes with nature. And I think this is a very important point. I think the fact that he characterizes this as a vow, a contract, a pledge, is going to fit in with some other examples that we're going to take a look at here in a minute. But first, I kind of want to go over a little bit more of what I see to be kind of the components of the ritual, which I believe can be divided into three basic groups. There is the first component, which is a boon. It is the wish, the thing that is being asked for. The second component would be the condition. This is something that must be fulfilled regardless of how mundane or trivial or absurd it is. There is a condition that one must, uphold in order to acquire this wish. And then the third is probably the most vague of them all. It is location. Now, the location given to us in Shuri is the bridge, this broken bridge that one must jump across, right? However, on the other side of this bridge is a temple, and the important thing about this temple is that it is very heavily implied that this is, not even heavily implied, this is almost explicitly stated that this temple is one of these storm warding areas. It is one of these places that is safe from the storm, right? Much like the Foundation or Apeiron or a luru, which will all kind of show up again later in this video. Now, in other words, this is a temple that is likely an area that produces very, very dense quantities of asymmetric nuclide R. So I think this last point is actually very, very important, right? Because I think this is the crux of the whole matter. This is how the ritual takes place. This is how it is powered, or something along those lines. So as we go through this video, we're going to go ahead and we'll keep circling back to these three components, seeing if the examples that we're looking at sort of fit these conditions, and if they are potentially, if not exactly Ask and Acquire ritual, something very similar to them, right? Now, before we really get into the meat of it, I do want to say that this is mostly going to be a theory slash speculation video, right? In terms of very hard, explicit evidence, we don't have a ton, right? We just have what the story's given us, which is mostly going to be circumstantial evidence. I'll try to back up as much of it as I can. However, a lot of it is going to be up to interpretation, up to implication, that sort of thing. So take it with a bit of a grain of salt, just keep an open mind, that sort of thing. In any case, let's go ahead and take a look at our first example. Now, the first example, and the most recent one for us as the players, is 1.5, the revival of the Luru games. Now, at the time, we were led to believe that Spathodia's status as a reincarnator was something that was kind of incidental, right? It was a coincidence, it was something that was intrinsic to her being, and we kind of just chalked it up to as one of those arcanum things, right? We don't really have an explanation, it just sort of happened. However, now we have a little bit more information regarding the mechanics of this world, and specifically certain phenomena that may occur in the vicinity of areas that are heavily, saturated with this asymmetric nuclide R. And if we take a look at Spathodia, or more accurately Flammy, we can kind of begin to see some similarities between, her situation and Shori's divination. Now, the location is fairly straightforward. The Luru Stadium is well documented to be an active ANR site, and the effects are potent enough to force, arcanists within the stadium into a state of mania, right? Resulting in like delirium, and if they stay there long enough, they will eventually lose consciousness. So the location is fairly explicit, right? Now, in terms of the boon and the condition, the things that you're asked and what you need to do to acquire them, it's a little bit more vague, or rather than vague, it seems to be more that they are more highly codependent on each other. They kind of bounce off each other. Because at a certain point in the Uluru story, we have a flashback of Flammy where she becomes the first priestess of the games, and she vows that she will watch over the games forevermore. Now, conveniently enough, her status as a reincarnator not only allows her to uphold this vow even beyond death, but it almost compels her to, right? Because as we see, as Spathodia first begins to reawaken to her previous life, and even before that, she sort of had this obsession with the games, and it only grows the more she learns. So we have a promise and an ANR site. So like the Broken Bridge, and as Jurian had stated prior, this seems very analogous with this idea of a vow with nature. Some requisite condition is met and a boon is given in turn. In this case, the condition and the boon seem to work sort of in tandem to uphold this initial promise that Flammy had made millennia ago. Now, I did want to bring up one other point for Luru, is that Spathodia is not actually the only reincarnator mentioned in 1.5. At one point, Ezra brings up a woman by the name of Dorothy Eady, claiming that she too had been a reincarnator. Now, we're not going to get too deep into Edie's case, but just know that she was a real-life person who actually existed, and her case was that she had fallen down a flight of stairs, and upon waking up after a brief coma, claimed to recall a past life in which she had been a pharaoh. Now, immediately, we see parallels with Spathodia's case, right? The onset of these past memories were triggered by physical trauma, and both previous lives seem to occupy sort of preeminent positions within their society. Now, while I don't see too much pertinence to the former, I think the latter is actually very important, right? Because having their past lives situated in positions of importance could mean that they were more likely to have access to locations that were highly saturated with ANR. Because so far, these locations that we've seen are areas of great significance. They're temples, they're notable landmarks, they are spiritual locations, luggage, that sort of thing, right? And they're generally places that the common folk may not have had easy access to. Spathodia had Uluru Stadium, right? And in Dorothy's case, who knows? Maybe it was a temple, maybe it was a pyramid, maybe it was a sock drawer, who knows? In any case, I think this, positioning is kind of one of the reasons why Ezra has claimed that reincarnators are exceptionally rare, right? Not only do they need to be people who could have access to these locations, but they also need to be able to fulfill the conditions of this wish or this contract rather. And I think if this ritual works similarly to ask and acquire or the divination work, then the wish that they need fulfilled needs to be at least somewhat conducive with reincarnation. Otherwise, the wish would just be fulfilled in some other more expedient way, right? However, as we know it, with both Spathodia and with ostensibly Edie, right, their wishes were fulfilled through reincarnation, which kind of implies that in some way reincarnation was helpful to, fulfilling their desires. Now, it does kind of bring up this question of if Spathidea or a future life of her ever chooses to, say, forsake the games or no longer uphold her vow, whether she will lose her reincarnator ability, as now the contract is null and void. It's just a little bit of a thought. It's nothing to delve into too deeply. But in any case, that is going to be it for Luru, and we're going to go on to look at the next case. And this next case is going to be Apeiron, the island of the math nerds. Now, Apeiron's a bit of a special case, right? Because not only do we know that the entire island is protected from the storm, but we also know the precise location of this storm warding effect. Or in other words, we have the specific, source of asymmetric nuclide R here. It is situated in a rock, in a cave that is at the center of the island. On top of that, we are also given direct acknowledgement by Vertin and by Sonetto that the whole island feels as if it is under some kind of grand ritual of some sort. And though they don't really expound on this, they do make the note that it seems more diffuse, right? Rather than directed. It seems more to be ambient in the atmosphere rather than something that is, directed and focused and, kind of dedicated to a task. Passively almost, right? Beyond that, we also know that the Apeironites will periodically visit this cave in order to deliver their proofs for approval from the rock. So, right off the bat, we have location, we have some form of condition being met, which is the proofs being delivered, and then we also have acknowledgement that this is a ritual. But what is the boon? What are they being given in return for these proofs being presented to the rock? Well, we know that the people of Apeiron value knowledge above physical matter, above emotion, above pretty much everything else, right? It is king. It is paramount. Now, this could mean that what they're being granted is simply knowledge, greater insight into the mechanisms of the world. It could mean that they're just capable of greater logical processes, that they're being granted bigger brains. Who knows? It could be that their intellect just surpasses what is capable by the mundane. Maybe. Everyone does seem fairly intelligent in their own way on this island, even if they may be somewhat deficit in others, right? Then again, this is a group of people who have devoted their entire being to the pursuit of knowledge. So I think it would still stand to reason that, blessed or not, they would surpass the intellectual average, right? So maybe not knowledge as a, general concept. What I think is being granted is knowledge in the form of the revelation. Now, if you did not play through, or if you skipped through chapter 5, which, fair, it was a long chapter, I still would recommend looking into it if you were so inclined, just because it does give us quite a bit to work with. But we find out that the designation of 6 on Apeiron is actually a hereditary position. When 1/6 passes, the number and the role as the island's leader is then given to the next one in line, right? And upon being appointed to this position, the new 6 is struck by the revelation, in which they are said to be granted knowledge on everything. Now, what exactly everything entails is a little bit nebulous, with the explanations being fairly vague. However, if we were to take the descriptions we're given of the revelation and 6's, or I guess Atticus to be more specific, Atticus's description of the revelation as he experiences it to at face value, then that means quite literally knowledge of everything. And I think this is the primary factor that leads me to believe that the revelation, rather than being an inherited, bloodline arcanum, a condition that is present within 6's bloodline, it is rather a boon that is granted to the leader of Apeiron through a ritual that could be asked and acquired. Now, we are told in 1.6 that the ritual is the ultimate wish granting ceremony, right? With capabilities that far outstrip anything a person would be capable of. In Apeiron and in Luru, we are given people who have abilities that seem almost transcendental in nature, right? We have reincarnation, which is essentially a defiance of both death and time. The person continues to exist even beyond physical or temporal boundaries. Meanwhile, we have on Apeiron the revelation, which is basically omniscience. To know and to comprehend everything is an impossible feat, and it is something that borders on divinity, right? It is the all-knowing. Now, the argument could be made that Six's lineage is just particularly old and pure. It is well established that the more ancient and unsullied an Arcanist's bloodline is, the more powerful their Arcanum actually becomes. And the revelation could simply be sort of the ultimate expression of this. And you know what? That could be true. We aren't ever really given an upper bound to what a pure-blooded Arcanist is capable of. However, we are given a glimpse with Druvis and to a lesser extent, Arcana of what they can do. Ultimately, what we are able to sort of glean from this is that their abilities are still bound firmly to the physical, right? There are constraints that they have to abide by. There are limitations to what they are capable of. Even with Arcana, with all of this implied power that she has, she is still forced to bend to the systems of the world, right? She is never really considered insurmountable or untouchable. She is still, a physical being that inhabits this world. On the other hand, something like omniscience or reincarnation seem almost metaphysical in nature. They are something beyond the ken of mortal people or physical constraints, right? They are, I would say, more of a conceptual boon rather than anything that you could say is situated concretely in physicality. So I do think there's a difference there, and kind of that the ask and acquire rituals sort of embody this difference, right? Now, one last thing that I kind of wanted to look at for Apeiron was how this revelation is sort of characterized, because we see it, or I mean Six rather, sees it as this thing external to himself. In his personal story, Trudge in the Long Night, he always refers to it as something beyond him, not necessarily something that he is born with or something intrinsic to his bloodline. It is something outside of himself, right? And if we were to look at how the other Apeironites sort of address it, it's very, very similar. They see it as this gift from on high. They see it as this God looking down and bestowing his blessing upon us, or, in Six's eyes, this great and terrible curse. And I thought this was very interesting because it kind of matches up with Shorty's divination, where they're seeking approval from the gods. They're seeking a way for their wishes to be granted by the gods themselves. And, in order to do this, they have a whole set of rituals. Send lanterns upriver, cross the broken bridge, that sort of thing. It's this very similar idea of divine intervention being the thing to grant these powers as opposed to something intrinsic to a person. I also thought that the naming conventions for all three of these rituals was very interesting, because if not religious, they are all somewhat spiritually charged, right? You have Shwari's divination, divination is looking into the future for advice or support. It's less of a religious thing and more of this like spiritual aid tool that soothsayers and seers use, like more of a traditional sort of thing, right? And then you have Luru's reincarnators. Well, reincarnation is a very significant idea in more Eastern mythos, Buddhism and what have you, with this idea of cycles and of samsara and of, reliving lives as a different people over and over again, that sort of thing, right? And then you have also Apeiron's revelation. Well, the revelation in certain contexts is a very biblical thing. It is the last book of the Bible. It is the record of the end times. And in some ways, Six kind of does act as this harbinger of the end times, because at certain points in his story, he mentions, he does make like this very ominous mention of how Apeiron's continual search for knowledge, right? Their incessant seeking of the truth, eschewing everything else, as a result, could lead to the downfall of the island, right? And he questions whether it is worth it to even pursue this knowledge if it could mean their end. To which we kind of actually do see a little bit of that in the end of chapter 5 when the island is under siege. I just thought it was a very interesting tie-in with these three, to have them all be tied to these ideas of various highly spiritual concepts. But that is going to be it for the Apeiron section. We're going to go ahead and move on now to the final section of the video. Right before we get into it, I would like to say this is probably the section that is going to have the least amount of actual concrete backing, right? With luru and with Apeiron, we kind of had like ideas and concepts that were there that could at least form some sort of scaffolding for us to work off of. We got none of that for these next couple sections. So this is all purely speculation. This is all, basically the ramblings of a madman, right? So going forward, go ahead and just, take a huge grain of salt with that. Now for this next section, even though we don't have a ton about it, I still did want to talk about it just because I wanted to cover, every A&R site that we have on record, right? Of which there are 3 more technically. I guess you could count the Foundation and Manus headquarters as multiple locations, right? Because I know the Foundation has separate branches, and I don't know how the storm immunity works with them. However, the fact that they are storm immune implies presence of ANR, right? Because that's pretty much the only thing that we know of at this point that allows for storm warding, right? This storm warding effect. And if ANR is present, then that also means that it is a potential candidate for a sort of ask and acquire ritual. Now, starting off with the Foundation, we don't know much about it, surprisingly, even though it is our primary base of operations, even though it is the side that we are aligned with, affiliated with, right? We don't have too much information beyond the bureaucracy and sort of kind of how it operates on a very basic level. That being said, I think we are given a clue on what exactly the locus of this storm warding effect is within the Foundation, and I think we get this clue from a very unlikely source, which would be the Roaring Jukebox. Now, the Roaring Jukebox is something that I think we're all familiar with, right? It is what we get as players for our battle pass, right? Our monthly battle pass, where you complete missions and you get rewards, etc. The thing about the jukebox is that it actually appears in game. Like, it exists as an object within the world of Reverse 1999, right? And the description that we get of it states, a mysterious machine once introduced but soon removed from the main bank. No one can predict when or where it would appear. Because the rewards for listening to the CDs of Roar Jukebox are incomparable, even if its music is strident, some arcanists still spend half a lifetime searching for it. But why the jukebox, right? Like, why would this be this asymmetric nuclide R, generator? And ultimately, I think it's mainly just how this jukebox is kind of described in the few descriptions that we do actually get of it, right? Because it's this mysterious arcane device that functions very similarly to how the rituals that we have seen prior function. Because if you look at it, it does kind of tick all of the boxes, at least at a very basic level, right? You have a condition, which is to look at all these or listen to all of these records. You have a reward, which is incomparable, as it puts it. And then in terms of location, well, if it's in the Foundation is quite old, at least centuries. If I recall correctly, it was established at some point before the Middle Ages, which would have been before the thousands, right? I will have to look into that, but I'm pretty sure that's the timeline. So it does tick these boxes. However, one thing that does throw me off is the fact that the jukebox itself is not one of these very, old or revered objects like the other things would have been, right? It's a jukebox. It plays music. And I think this could point to maybe this being an artificial form of storm protection, because we know from chapter 2 in the interrogation scene that the Foundation has been trying to experiment on kids in order to find some way to avoid the storm, as it were, or something to that end. Now we do kind of get the sense that Vertin might have been lying at that point, but if she wasn't, then this could be sort of an attempt to mimic this storm warding effect to a much less pronounced degree, right? It could also explain why the blessings from the jukebox are significantly less potent and a lot less flexible than something like Shuori's divination or Luru's reincarnators or Apeiron's revelation, right? And while we are on the topic of artifice, we can now talk about the Suitcase, because obviously we know that the Suitcase is one of these storm-safe sites, with some caveats, right? And I think that's very fitting, because clearly the Suitcase is one of these objects that is not necessarily naturally occurring. It's not like Apeiron's Rock, it's not like Luru's Stadium. It is very much, at least in terms of appearance, something that is crafted by human hands. Now, I think this is very fitting, and I think it lines up with kind of the idea of the jukebox, in that because it is one of these things that seem to be created by mankind, the effects of whatever it grants are maybe a little less potent, right? In terms of storm safety, it only grants safety to arcanists. Humans, we know, are deleted the moment the storm comes through. And again, it does fulfill all of the prerequisites, right? You have the locus, the center of this ANR generation, which is the spinning wheel at the center of the lake, right? You have a condition, which is to offer clear drops and unilogs, which, you know, going by the descriptions they've been given in game, do actually exist within the world. And you have a reward, which is to pull an arcanist or even just a person out of time and out of space and deliver them to you in the suitcase, right? So it is more of a mild effect, I would say, compared to like the other ones that we've seen. But again, this is more, I think, a example of this being a product of artifice as opposed to some naturally occurring sight or product, right? Now, I do have a little bit of a theory regarding the suitcase. Again, I know I keep saying this, but again, no substantiation here. This is just me thinking aloud, right? I think it's possible that the original contractor of the spinning wheel had been Vertin's mother, right? And I think the boon, the gift granted, was Vertin's immunity to the storm, right? It had been conferred onto her as opposed to anything else. And the reason I think this is because the storm warding effect is kind of one of these things that you could sort of see as a defiance of the natural order of the world, right? It kind of removes Vertin from the flow of time whenever one of these reverses happen. And although we know that the Foundation was kind of looking into it with their whole, you know, using kids as experimental subjects, we don't really have any indication that that was going well in the slightest, right? In Chapter 5, we find out that they're only now kind of recognizing the qualities of this storm immunity after we're able to obtain a sample of one of Manus Vindictae's masks. And even then, it's at a very primitive baseline value. So for them to have kind of figured out how to make a kid stormproof almost a decade ago at this point seems a bit far-fetched to me. As for what was given in order for this to happen, I think it could either have to do with how Vertin's mother is no longer around, or it could have to do with how Vertin's affinity for Arcanum is very, very weak. She has professed herself that she's just no good at using magic, right? And I think that this could be a fact of either the ritual taking something from her or using her natural abilities in order to fuel this this gift that is given to her, right? So yeah, that's just a theory. Nothing too terribly exciting there, I don't think. But with that, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the last one, which isn't even really a thing, I don't think, because the last section would be the Manus headquarters. And as far as we know, we don't have any information on the Manus headquarters, like, at all, right? We know they had a base at the Walden back in 1929, and we know that sometime in the 1980s, I believe, they had a base that was close by the Foundation enough where they could send Elidiaus to draw propaganda and what have you for the kids. We're not even certain that their storm immunity is something that is intrinsic to their headquarters. It could just all be based on Arcana's masks, right? But with that, that's going to be pretty much the end of the video. In terms of closing notes, I didn't really have anything too pressing to, you know, take note of. I did think it was a little bit interesting how you could kind of draw these lines to previous events and how like previous things were sort of recontextualized now that we have new information to work off of. Now, whether these new interpretations are valid or at all feasible is still up in the air, but I think it's still something interesting to talk about, right? Or at least explore a little bit. But that's going to be the video. And if you have stuck around this far, thank you very much. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you for the next one, yeah? Bye-bye.